All right. Hi, everyone. Everyone hear me okay in the back? Thumbs up. Awesome. Thank you all. Cool. Welcome back. I'm glad everyone is staying dry, hasn't washed away in our lovely precipitation this week. Good news, we'll be talking this lecture about an ecosystem that's really dependent on intermittent rainfall like we're getting this week. So hopefully it shows a little bit of a bright side to getting soaked walking to class. So today, as you can see, our lecture topic, our biome, will be the grasslands of California. A couple things. So as a reminder, your midterm is coming up on Tuesday. So this upcoming Tuesday, so through the weekend, and then we'll be back to take the test in class. Not particularly long. You'll just show up here as normal. It'll be a combination of multiple choice, a little bit of fill in the blank, and some short answer questions. The multiple choice is going to be really similar to what you saw on our homework quiz, the ones you did last week, week and a half ago, something like that. And then apologies, by the way. I said I would post the study guide on Tuesday. I forgot in doing that we shifted our grasslands lecture to be before the midterm. So I just want to get through today's lecture, see how much we get through, and adjust the study guide appropriately. It'll be posted this afternoon. Yeah, Kai? No, it's a good question. You will not be expected to memorize any scientific names whatsoever. No Latin in this class. Save that for your taxonomy classes or maybe Latin classics for some of you. Much tougher. Yeah, great question. Okay, on that note, it'll include material up through this lecture. Other upcoming stuff, keep in mind your first two submissions for your habitat account stuff are due the 16th, so the following Sunday. Again, those are the first two of your 3 themes that you'll eventually do. If you have any uncertainty what your habitat and themes are at this point, again, please let us know ASAP. But I think just about all of you are up to speed on that. The full prompt is under the habitat account module on Canvas. It's got a rubric on there too. And hopefully our lecture on Tuesday about research has been at least somewhat useful if it was new information to anyone. Both myself and your TAs are happy to offer feedback. If even after reading the instructions and rubric you kind of feel like I'm not quite sure what they're looking for, or as a couple of you have already done, which is really exciting, you have an idea to kind of put your own personal twist and put your own flavor on this assignment and have an idea, let us know. We're happy to do that during office hours, shoot us an email, whatever. And again, this is just kind of finger wagging, but it's useful when it comes down to later this quarter. If you kind of try to do a little bit more upfront work on these first 2 pieces, edits get a little bit easier and it saves you work down the road. So again, do whatever you have time for. You guys are grown adults, but historically, folks who kind of put a little bit more thought into the first draft of these 2 narrative pieces, or not just narrative pieces, but these 2 pieces, tend to save a little bit of grief in the long term. Any questions about the midterm or the habitat account stuff? Yeah, Griff. Okay. Okay, anyone else having that problem? Anyone else try to access? This is awesome. Thanks for letting me know. I'll fix that right after class. It's probably just a misclick on my part, so thanks, Griff. Okay, any other questions? Great. Okay, so let's talk about grasslands. And after today's lecture, there are a couple of things we hope you'll be capable of doing. So we're going to talk about the plant composition in these grasslands of California, both now and prior to European colonization, because they are very, very different in this area particularly. We're going to spend some time talking about identification of key adaptations that grassland plants and animals have in California that allow them to survive in their environment, mostly those related to diet and predation, eating and not being eaten. A lot of the equation of being a successful animal in the world, right? And we're going to look a little bit, no hard numbers, nothing like that, about how we might experiment, analyze, try to measure how species composition might change over time based on what we see today and what we saw in the past. Sound good? Great. So, grasslands, right? Think about a grassland, think about a big open habitat, not a lot of features, kind of savanna type. But I really challenge you as we're going through this lecture to try to change your perspective a little bit on this, because grasslands are really fascinating when you kind of stop thinking about them from a perspective that's 5 or 6 feet off the ground, right? To us, grasslands, and we'll talk more about this complex structure, often sort of little arrangements of little herbaceous plants, grasses, sometimes bunch grasses, maybe a few scattered shrubs and trees. But if you think about yourself from the perspective of something like a small mammal or an invertebrate, instead of having this very low down, small, somewhat featureless ecosystem, you have what is an incredibly complex jungle with a canopy and predator-prey dynamics, complex food webs, crazy torrential downpours, all kinds of intense disturbances that really are fascinating to study at their proper scale, right? So again, grasses. Grasses are all herbs, herbaceous plants from the family Poaceae. Taxonomy, we have our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and all of our grasses belong to family Poaceae. Again, no Latin, don't have to remember that, right? There are sedges and rushes in there, but these grasslands are, appropriately enough, often dominated by grasses. But it's not just grasses. We also often have a lot of what we call forbs. Anyone heard the term forbs before, outside of the business magazine? Cool, yeah, so forbs is this botanical term you may run into going forward if you look about the stuff. And forbs are small leafy plants, right? So if you think about little flowers, your buttercups, your clovers, that sort of thing, those are forbs. Small green plants, often good food for herbivores that have broad flat leaves instead of narrow stalks like grass. And then believe it or not, in our grassland ecosystems, as you've seen in the Central Valley, I'm sure, we often have some scattered shrubs and trees. These are not herbs, they're not herbaceous plants, they're woody, right? And so these trees and shrubs are often scattered through grassland ecosystems, but by definition, they tend not to be the dominant plants we see. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a grassland, it'd be a forest of some kind. So, kind of some definitions and composition for the landscape here. So grasslands occur in a lot of different places in California, but they are most commonly seen around the edge of the Central Valley here. So this is sort of our distribution of grasslands in California, and they kind of tend to form this ring around the edge of the valley, in addition to some sort of relic ecosystems down further in Southern California, a bit in the north end, so on and so forth. But you can really see this light green fringe around the Central Valley and somewhat in the center of that, right? And that has to do with our state variables. Remember, our states of habitats, combinations of temperature and precipitation that sort of dictate roughly, this is not an exact diagram by any stretch of the imagination, what ecosystem is likely to show up in a given area, remember? So our grasslands tend to be sort of moderate, right? Sort of median temperatures, fairly low, but intermittent rainfall, right? So not dry enough to be a desert, can still support a decent amount of plant life, hence the grasses, that sort of thing, but, you know, fairly moderate. So kind of middle of the road in terms of environmental characteristics, not particularly extreme in one way or the other. Make sense? But it's not just climate here, right? There's a lot of other state factors that come into how grasslands arise. Things like soil conditions and soil composition, fire, grazing, especially historically when we had massive herds of native herbivores, right? These all contribute and maintain grassland habitats and stop them from shifting to other different biomes, right? So keep in mind, as we're talking about this, grasslands really are, across North America, but particularly in California, an endangered ecosystem, right? This is a fairly famous figure looking at landscape composition in the Central Valley of California. Pre-1900s, before implementation of intense farming, agriculture, herding, ranching, that sort of thing, most of the Central Valley was a combination of wetlands and grasslands, right? These darker greens are wetlands, dark blues, of course, aquatic. This is a lake that no longer exists. And then we had a lot of grasslands where things were just not quite wet enough to be a wetland. Shocking, right? But then, as we see intensity of agriculture, urbanization, development, human colonization, we just kind of have this relic ring of grasslands around the edge of the Central Valley, right? So I think 95 to 97% of native grasslands in California across the whole state are gone. So like a lot of other sort of native ecosystems, it is in decline because we as humans historically like agriculture. We like to eat. We have to live in towns and cities as well, right? But it turns out that despite that, there still are a lot of incredibly diverse grasslands that still exist in California. And again, when we think of grasslands, it doesn't just have to be that sort of stereotypical, you know, big rolling hill oak savanna with one or two trees popping up here and there. There's a lot of diversity. So just in California, we have places like Peraza Meadows, and we've never been up there in the Northeast, dominated by beautiful wildflowers at higher elevation. Conditions are right, despite it being a little bit higher elevation, to maintain a grassland in this montane, mountainous ecosystem. We have places like Point Reyes. Have you never been there? Yeah, Point Reyes is pretty cool, right? Check out some of the grasslands here. Diverse and sometimes even native, we'll talk about this, grasslands, even right on the coast, where you have pretty intense weather systems coming off the ocean. We have places like Jasper Ridge, sort of this chaparral-y, a lot of shrubs, but broken grasslands out by the Bay Area. Ever been to Jasper Ridge? It's owned by Stanford in part, and it maintains one of the longest running monitoring stations for climate change in North America, at least. And then places like Antelope Valley, further south. This is actually specifically called the Antelope Valley Poppy Reserve because of these incredible blooms and this dominant community of poppies that exist down there. Anyone been to Antelope Valley? Yeah, cool spot, right? So, if you've been in California for a while, this kind of beautiful Golden Hills stereotypical presentation of a grassland might be familiar to you, right? The Golden Hills of California, if you've ever driven to the Bay Area or even driven north towards Redding, that sort of thing in the summer, you see a lot of this, right? And it turns out, believe it or not, this is probably not the historic state of grasslands in these regions, right? Historically, prior to mostly Spanish colonization on the West Coast, on those hills, we'd probably see communities that looked a little bit more like this, right? One of the key differences is between something what we call annual grasses and perennial grasses. Anyone here a gardener heard the term annual or perennial before, right? Anyone feel like telling me what the difference might be and feel like they could take a stab at it? Yeah, Carmen?
Plants complete their life cycle within a year, but plants can take a couple of years.
Exactly. So annual plants have a 1-year life cycle. They germinate, grow, reproduce, and die within a single year. Perennial plants survive multiple years, have these more complex life cycles. And so it turns out that prior to Spanish colonization, a lot of Californian grasslands were probably dominated by native bunch grasses, these perennial grasses that grow sort of in these little clusters, these puffs that survive year to year. Whereas nowadays, for a lot of reasons we'll talk about in a bit here, they've kind of been pushed out by invasive or non-native, depending on how you think about it, annual grasses, right? Grasses that grow up, take advantage of a quick influx of good conditions, nutrients, reproduce, drop a bunch of seeds, and then die. And so these are the post-reproductive annual grasses you're seeing here. If this community were much more perennial grasses, as it was historically, we'd see a much more green hills of California year-round. And so it turns out the settlers, first colonizers who came out here, probably saw a slightly more green set of hills around the California grasslands. And so yeah, as Carmen pointed out, one of the key differences that we see here is the replacement of native perennial grasses that survive year to year by invasive annual grasses. So again, an annual grass is simply or an annual plant rather, is simply a plant that starts off as a seed at the beginning of a year or at some point in the year, germinates, grows, flowers and reproduces, and then dies. Doesn't try to persist when conditions are bad through the winter, through the dry summer, through whatever the bad season is in its area. It just kind of shoots its shot and then dies. Perennial plants try to survive year to year. So they germinate, grow, flower. They might die back and kind of reduce their biomass to kind of hunker down and survive a dry summer or cold winter. Then they do it all over again. So they hopefully stay alive quite a lot longer, right? And so there are some reasons that we have seen this replacement, right? So we have a lot more of these non-native annual dominated grasslands than we did before, prior to this colonization period. And especially even in places where agriculture hasn't become all that intense, we see it in sort of unfarmed, unsettled areas in the Central Valley, the Bay Delta area, all this stuff, right? And so it's really interesting that we see this stuff. Despite the fact that these grasslands persisted, they've been kind of replaced. Sort of the fundamental plants that make up these grassland communities in a lot of places have been replaced by non-native annual grasses, and yet they still exist as grasslands. The function they serve for a lot of vertebrate species in California still persists. They still make good forage. You can still eat the plants, even if they're annual plants. But, it's different. It's fundamentally separate than what we saw before we started really keeping modern scientific histories. So we don't really know exactly what has changed, per se, right? So the way this happened was thusly. From the late 1700s onward, Spanish missions, we all talked about Spanish arrival. If those of us who are here are Californians, took this sort of unit in high school, we've probably talked about it in some intro classes here at college. Intense cattle ranching, intense agriculture, this really strong onset of intensive grazing by domesticated cattle herds, fire suppression, various other things, sort of pushed down these long-lived perennial grasses and allowed these annual grasses to take over and dominate the landscape. There are a lot of Eurasian grasses that were also introduced, both intentionally and accidentally in California. So things like oats. If you don't know about oats, it's something we commonly eat, introduced very intentionally for food. Bromes for cattle forage. Different kind of forbs, these leafy plants for cattle forage, and because they're useful to us, things like mustards, were introduced and sort of pushed out the native grasses in a lot of different ways. So one of the big reasons that we see this replacement has to do with timing. Annual grasses are really quick to react, right? So in conditions where things are very stable, there's not a lot of disturbance over time, these native perennial grasses can kind of take their time, grow slowly, proliferate, seed, and kind of take over these fairly stable, consistent ecosystems. When you get areas like California post-colonization where you have a lot of disturbance, a lot of intense agriculture, a lot of different cataclysmic events, these annual grasses are really, really good at being like, hey, quick, I germinate first, this is mine. And so they germinate often earlier than perennial grasses. They seed more quickly, and so they can take advantage of changing conditions, things that are a little bit less stable, to dominate landscapes that are undergoing flux, right? So because, in part, there's many other reasons here, because we saw a lot of these disturbances, changes, shifts in all kinds of environmental regimes, these annual grasses tended to outcompete the native bunch grasses and take over the landscape, right? And so they maintain dominance to this day. One of the problems with this is that in terms of modern Western scientific record keeping, we don't know exactly what these landscapes were like before this happened. It started happening in the 1700s, it was kind of continuing through the 1800s. We weren't really keeping, as European-based scientists, records of this over time. So what actually came before? There's a couple of different dominant theories here, right? One of these theories is what's called the bunchgrass grazing hypothesis. And this idea says that, yeah, in fact, these native bunch grasses, particularly a couple, one called the purple needlegrass, was dominant in California, right? It was there, it was a pretty stable ecosystem, it's probably mostly bunch grasses. Then it got overgrazed by these cattle and sheep and goats, and these Eurasian, mostly annual grass species came and dominated the landscape, right? So that's one possibility. There's another one called the flower fields hypothesis, right? Similar idea, except this one sort of contends that, hey, it wasn't actually perennial bunch grasses. Conditions in California are still kind of in flux, even historically. There's things like storms, droughts, all the stuff that can disturb perennial grass communities. So in a lot of these places, it was still annual plants, these plants that are very fast-lived and can take advantage of good conditions, but it was native wildflowers, forbs, that could create these beautiful, colorful hills, right? Because there were no Eurasian annual grasses that were even stronger competitors, they were able to dominate these landscapes, but it was still annuals, right? So these are sort of two competing hypotheses. Was it mostly native bunch grasses in the past? Was it mostly forbs and wildflowers, right? Let's talk about this, right? Let's think a little bit about naturalists, as naturalists, sort of be logisticians here, and think if you were in the position of trying to discover and figure out which of these hypotheses were more true, how might you go about figuring that out? Through data collection, through designing an experiment. But let's chat with each other for a minute and see what we come up with. How might you go about trying to figure out which of these is the more true hypothesis? So let's chat for a minute, see what we come up with. All right, anyone have any thoughts on this? If you were tasked with figuring out, hey, historically, prior to colonization, did we see more perennial bunch grasses or annual flowers and forbs on the landscape? Any idea how might you go about trying to figure that out? There's no wrong answer here. This is really just brainstorming. Have any thoughts, guesses, ideas? Very safe place to be wrong. Yeah?
If you look at the eating habits of organisms that used to live in the area to see if they preferred one or the other.
Ah, it's interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point. So potentially looking at the eating and diet preferences of organisms that lived here. If they lived here alongside these historic native communities, they should have evolved a preference for the one that was more abundant, or at least an ability to find it. So if they prefer one or the other, that's a really innovative way to go about that. Any other thoughts? Yeah, in the back.
Looking at like water levels, the contrast of it would be able to grow better and more of a
Yeah, so that's a great one. So one of the things we can do is look at the existing members of these species, figure out what conditions they're adapted for, and then go back and look at the areas where we think they may or may not have occurred and said, hey, the conditions in this area were actually probably better for bunch grasses versus forbs, right? So look at historical environmental conditions, even if we can't see what the plants were. Other thoughts? These are great. Yeah, all right.
Can you try to take a look at the seed bank?
Yeah, okay, this is an awesome one. Who's heard of the seed bank before, right? No one's heard of the seed bank. Okay, awesome. So the seed bank is all of the seeds that exist in the soil. And it turns out seeds, especially from some ecosystems, especially wetlands, are incredibly good at surviving in the soil. When conditions are variable, seeds can exist in the soil for decades, for centuries, without germinating and just waiting for conditions to be right to sprout and germinate, right? So I talked about that lake that formed in Southern California. So this is historical on that map. We'll go back for a sec to kind of explain this real quick. Back up quite a bit here. So this is a lake, I think it's no, not Tuolumne, starts with a T. This is a very, very shallow lake that used to exist in Southern California. Very shallow, dried up, completely gone. Between agricultural use, landscape draining, that sort of thing, totally gone. Used to be wetland plant community, you know, diverse, marsh plants, that sort of thing, then gone. 2 years ago, we had these torrential rains in Southern California, and this lake reformed. The ghost of this historic lake coming back to take vengeance on a couple of towns that were in there that got flooded out, right? But the crazy thing is this lake had not been wet since the early 1900s, and yet following the inundation event, following the flood, we saw wetland plant species start to germinate. Those seeds were still in the seed bank, in that sort of buried vault of the soil, ready to germinate. So yeah, looking at the seed bank is definitely a possibility and something that has been done. It's a good observation. Other thoughts? Man, you guys are awesome. Okay, so one of the things we've done, actually Valerie Evner, who is a PI at UC Davis, has tried to go in and figure out, well, there are some little pocket areas that never really got disturbed too badly, that sort of got spared these intense pressures and disturbances of historical events, right? And so she went out to these different spots and surveyed, she and her crew obviously. And they looked at how much of that landscape was covered in perennial grasses and how much was covered in annual flowers, annual forbs, that sort of thing, right? So don't worry too much about this. These are names you may or may not recognize. But take a look at these last two columns, right? These percentages. This is how much of the landscape was covered by each of these types, right? So take a look. Anyone able to look at that and have a thought? Does this sort of support one hypothesis or the other? By looking at this data, at least, do we think that historically it was more dominated by perennial grasses or forbs? I believe in you guys on this one. Any thoughts on that? I'm hearing the murmur, forbs, 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 forbs. That's great, yeah. Get the chant going. Yeah, so this data certainly suggests that in areas that never really went through those disturbances, as far as we know, forbs and flowers were probably the more dominant historical group. So this is a piece of evidence, and it turns out that most evidence historically suggests that it was in fact forbs that tend to dominate more of this landscape. So hundreds of years ago, we may have seen more of these beautiful tie-dye hills during blooms, right? Certainly plenty of perennial grasslands still existed. There's a lot of evidence for that too. But in terms of the overall composition, if you took averages across a lot of California, we might have seen more of these little flowering meadows than we expected, even 10, 20 years ago. Make sense? Cool. So I talk about disturbance as if it's sort of this massive catastrophic thing. Disturbance means sort of any kind of perturbation to your ecosystem. But it turns out disturbance, kind of general term, is actually a really important part of the function of a lot of different ecosystems, including, and sometimes you might say especially, grasslands, right? Disturbance is not a bad word. It's not a four-letter word. When we have catastrophic human-induced disturbance like invasive species, overgrazing, intense monoculture, agriculture, that can be bad. But disturbance is good in a lot of ways, especially in places like grasslands that are kind of reliant on disturbance to maintain biodiversity. Because it turns out that historically, the grasslands of California and North America in general were disturbed prior to European colonization, prior to human colonization, right? We had, in North America, massive herds of megafauna. We think we mentioned the term megafauna in here before. Anyone sort of know what that one means? Feel like raising their hand? What does megafauna mean? Probably get it from translation clues. Is that a hand, Genevieve? Giant animal, megafauna, big animal. Your bison, your puma, your giant ground sloth, your giant armadillo, all this stuff. And even now we have some megafauna in North America, right? And so it turns out that when you have herds of millions of bison cruising, bison, antelope, whatever the case may be, cruising across these grasslands, grazing and eating grass, that really is a disturbance, right? It's natural, it's part of the ecosystem, part of the cycle, but it's a disturbance. It's a destructive event. If you're a bison, it's great news. If you're a bunch grass, it's very bad news. But there's this thing called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. This idea that there's some kind of medium level of disturbance, not none, not crazy catastrophic storms every day, that actually maintains more diversity in the system, right? Because by disturbing certain portions or at low intensities across a landscape, especially something like grasslands, you kind of keep things at different levels. If things stay stable for a very long time, you don't have grazing, you don't have fires, eventually the species that are really good at taking advantage of long-term stable condition, things like trees, colonize and it becomes very stable. If you have crazy, intense, fast conditions, then nothing can really colonize. But if you have intermediate disturbance, like we saw historically in California grasslands, it maintains a lot of different ecological niche space, a lot of different varying conditions on the landscape that allow different communities to persist at the same time. Does that make sense? So even though I'm talking about disturbance as kind of this crazy thing that really fundamentally changed the California grasslands, there's disturbance at lower levels across geological and evolutionary time, and it can be really helpful, right? And it's not just things like megafauna grazing, right? There was quite a bit of fire. You guys may have heard about this. Fire is a very hot topic, so to speak, in California right now. It's not to make light of recent tragedies, but fire management has been something that's been really at the top of ecological conversation for the last 20 years or so, right? And it turns out that fires were not only a natural part of the ecosystem in California, lightning strikes, all kinds of stuff could start low-level fires in California grasslands, but indigenous groups in California would use fire in grassland for a couple different reasons, right? It wasn't just because they had prescient knowledge of, oh, if we don't start fire, then fuel will build up, we'll have more intense fires later, but it was a part of sort of the cultural survival here, right? By starting fires, they could do things like suppress these grasses and certain plants that weren't particularly useful for them, support the growth of native grasses that they did use for various reasons, and even support game. If things get too tall, too intense, get shrubby, burn it, nice green grass grows, the game, the animals come in and eat it, you eat the game, right? There are even things in a lot of the groups out here like herding grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are a great source of protein. And by setting a fire on one end of a field, you can wait at the other end of the field, a lot of grasshoppers will come towards you. So it was even used as harvest. So there was a lot of actually implementation of low-level burning to manage grasslands in California. A lot of sort of oral history of this and a lot of recently interviews and sort of respect of traditional ecological knowledge here. So this is Don Hankins, a member of the Plains Miwok tribe, and he says, in pre-contact times, indigenous peoples applied fire to small areas that dried first in the landscape. Given this selective practice, it is understandable how fires later in the season, deliberately set to harvest grasshoppers or started by lightning, could be kept in check, since fewer grasses and forbs covered the surrounding areas, right? Some other accounts here from the Poma tribe. Grass burned each year. The brush would burn. Fires were started and allowed to burn every place. Special spots were prepared to serve as safe spots. Game were caught this way. Herding animals by starting fires was a common practice. Burning was in the fall of the year when plants were all dried up when it was going to rain. They'd burn every 2 years. Both men and women would set fires. They wouldn't get very high, meaning the fires, right? Interesting. So it turns out this idea of burning landscapes, even intentionally as a human sort of group, is useful. Anyone heard the term fuel load or fire suppression recently? It's come up in ecological news in general a lot. It turns out that this historical regime of low-grade fires very frequently in these grassland landscapes like we see in much of the Central Valley was good in the sense that it wouldn't allow these massive amounts of dead grass and wood and limbs and stuff to build up on the landscape. It would sort of reset the board and clear it. One of the many reasons we see higher intensity, more widespread, catastrophic wildfires these days is because we as humans don't love being in fire. And so historically what we've done is stopped fire from starting whatsoever. Take pains to stop fires from starting. And so what we've had happen is this fuel, this burnable substance in the landscape is built up more than it would under historic fire regimes. And so when a fire does happen, there's more fuel, it burns longer, hotter, more intensely, and is more destructive, right? So that disturbance, that same disturbance, can be really useful in things like suppressing catastrophic wildfires. And so it turns out historically, this practice of prescribed burns, hopefully some of us have heard that term before, driving down the highway, anyone driven by a prescribed burn? If you go out to Yosemite or anywhere in the mountains, sometimes the US Forest Service will be out there, you see a lot of signs saying, this is a prescribed burn, we mean to do this, don't call 911, gets kind of smoky out there. And so it turns out this idea of prescribed burns, intentionally setting fire to things in the modern era to help the ecosystem prevent catastrophic wildfires is kind of coming into vogue. It's kind of being seen as maybe a more viable and wiser practice than it was historically. Used to be a lot more difficult to do in terms of legality and liability, but it turns out that in the last 30, 40 years, these permanent practices that have developed in collaboration with a lot of these First Nation groups, the Yurok, the Karuk, the Ochadihi, Winton Nation, a lot of other tribes that practice this historically kind of come together and actually implement prescribed burns, right? So kind of cool stuff there. So again, talking about the landscape side of things before we finish off talking about the animals. Currently, a lot of the grasslands we see in California were a novel combination of a bunch of Eurasian species, some relic natives that have managed to hang on, survive, even dominate in certain areas. There's no strong consensus on what everything was like in the past, but it turns out that flower field hypothesis, in part because of that data we looked at a minute ago, seems probably more accurate, at least in the past 10 or 20,000 years, which when it comes to plant communities is about as far back as we can look accurately. So historically, combination of native perennial grasses, but more native forbs and flowers, forming these stunning blooming meadows at certain times of year. Now, a mix of mostly annual grasses sourced from non-native backgrounds, introduced agricultural species, that sort of thing. Make sense? And again, management regimes on this, quote unquote, whether they be natural management regimes like massive herds of bison or active management regimes like prescribed burns, have changed a lot, right? So different conditions, different management regimes really affect how these biomes manifest. Any questions on sort of this historical and plant side of things? Cool, let's talk about some of the animals in here, right? Let's video time. Let's talk about a couple of animals here. So as we talk about a couple of species here, be thinking about what we know about this biome, about these grasslands, and how these animals are adapted to living there, right? In particular, a lot of times when we think about the major adaptations that animals possess, they kind of fall into 3 different categories, 2 of which we'll talk about here. Obtaining food and moving predators. Well, really 4, I should say. So eating, not being eaten, being able to move around your environment, and being able to talk to others. Anyone have a thought in terms of fitness, one that might be missing here? Reproduction tends to be the other one. We won't talk too much about that because we're mostly talking about functional adaptations, right? So eating, not being eaten, moving around, and being able to communicate with either members of your species or others, right? Let's talk about the burrowing owl. Who's seen a burrowing owl before? Who knows they live in Davis? Yeah, there's a couple of burrowing owl colonies just around in Davis. If you look, I think even this time of year, you can potentially find burrowing owls. Go out in dawn and dusk. They are one of the most photogenic animals out there. Super cool. And they're grassland specialists, right? So let's take a look at some video of a burrowing owl here. You might guess what they're calling this.
Unusually for an owl, this male is active both night and day. At only 10 inches tall, he's vulnerable to predators, so he's on high alert.
Those legs are
He's
quite a
made
bit
his
longer than we
home
see
on
on
an
most
area
owls.
of higher ground with little vegetation, giving him clear views of approaching predators like snakes and raptors.
Raptors being predatory birds.
With
hawks,
no
kites,
trees
eagles.
to nest in, this might seem like a strange home. But this is no ordinary bird. He's a burrowing owl. The only owl species in the world to live underground. They can dig their burrows from scratch. But this male has moved into an abandoned armadillo burrow, while making a few alterations of his own.
Cool stuff, right? So I mentioned a couple of these over here, but a couple of key things, right? Where do most owls nest? If you think about where you'd find an owl nest, this is not a trick question or anything like that, and would think what sort of feature on the landscape might hold an owl nest. Any thoughts on this? Yeah.
Somewhere up high, like a tree.
Exactly, right? Up high, trees, sometimes cliffs, that sort of thing. In a grassland, very few of those, right? Not a ton of them. They tend to be a little bit sparse, scraggly, that sort of thing. So burrowing owls have evolved to instead burrow into the ground, really literally flip the script and dig for shelter. Any other adaptations we saw or noticed in our burrowing owl? Yeah, Emily? Yeah, sorry, I mentioned this briefly, but yeah, they have longer legs than other owls. They tend to spend more time walking on the ground in these open landscapes. And so instead of having instead of having legs with feathers all the way down to their feet, like we'd see in a snowy owl, which needs them for warmth or that sort of thing, this bird that's on the ground in high grass in hot weather has longer legs. Yeah.
These owls fly.
Yeah, they absolutely can. Yeah, so they can fly no problem, but they tend to walk around on the ground because that's where their prey is. These guys aren't chasing down birds or anything like that. They'll eat little rodents or bugs that tend to be hanging around on the ground. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question. Yeah. So some of our owls are very, very nocturnal. Things like spotted owls or barn owls. Some owls are less strictly tied to night or day, and our burrowing owls are more diurnal than a lot of other owls. That's a really good observation and may well be an adaptation to a very open landscape where it's helpful to be out in the day. Much of your prey is active during the day. Kind of a cool thing. If you're looking at an owl, you can kind of get a brief sense of how nocturnal it is based on the color of its eyes. Owls with completely dark eyes tend to be much more nocturnal. Owls with yellow eyes, like the burrowing owl, tend to be mainly nocturnal, but are more diurnal than the dark-eyed owls. Kind of cool. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it's an eye structure thing, and it basically affects how good your night vision is. But often if you have incredibly good night vision like a spotted owl, the trade-off is your vision in light might not be quite as good as it could be otherwise. Cool. Let's talk about another animal here. Pacific rattlesnakes, right? Crotalus oreganus. First lecture, we talked about avoiding one from your car, right? Anyone ever seen one? Rattlesnakes around here? Ever been struck at by a rattlesnake? Yeah, me neither, but no thanks. Right? And so there's a lot of really cool stuff and interactions that happen in grassland ecosystems with rattlesnakes. There's this thing called an evolutionary arms race. Ground squirrels are a common prey item for rattlesnakes in California, especially our California ground squirrel. And it turns out that there's this kind of evolutionary chase, this sort of back and forth that goes on between these two species, where a lot of adult ground squirrels will actually evolve resistance to rattlesnake venom over time, right? So it won't actually kill them. They can get away, they can hide, right? But rattlesnakes then evolve more intense or slightly different venom to try to sort of catch up to that. And so there's this evolutionary arms race where this predator and prey species kind of try to outdo each other to survive. In fact, most of the time, rattlesnakes won't even go after adult California ground squirrels. They go after the young ones because they're smaller, more manageable, don't bite as bad, and are less resistant to the rattlesnake venom. But you have this really complex interaction that kind of goes between those two species. Everyone see that? That was real time, by the way. Oh, no, never mind. That's a jump, my mistake. But here we go. Here's the rattlesnake emerging from the den. This is a rattlesnake that almost certainly went in and was able to raid a California ground squirrel den here, potentially eat a juvenile. So, one of the cool things we see when it comes to adaptations, we call convergent evolution. Anyone heard that term before? Convergent evolution is a really cool one. It turns out that sometimes in obvious ways and sometimes in ways we really don't understand, if you are an animal, say a mouse or something, that lives in a certain type of biome, there are adaptations that are really good for living in that biome. Whether that biome exists in North America, Africa, Australia, there are certain things like, let's say, diurnal vision in a spotted owl, or long legs, or being able to burrow underground, that are great for living in grasslands. And there are quite a few examples of this when it comes to grassland systems. So for example, this is our western meadowlark. Who's seen one of these? So go out to Yolo Bypass, any of the grasslands around Sacramento, you can see plenty of them. They're really beautiful, have a lovely song. This is a yellow-throated longclaw, who thinks they look somewhat similar. Yeah, I'd agree, right? They have no relation to each other whatsoever, except that they're both birds. Not even in the same family, completely different, right? But they both live in grassland, shrubby biomes, right? And so it turns out they have a lot of the same adaptations, some of which we kind of understand. The shape of their bill, how they get food is kind of a good way to pluck animals off grass, eat seeds, that sort of thing. But there are other things about this convergent evolution we still don't understand. We don't know why this coloration, even the patterning, evolves so similarly in these two species that have no relationship and live so far away. So really cool. We're able to understand some of this convergent evolution, but certainly not all, right? And then you can see that even though it looks like a very, very bright yellow, when it comes to being in an area dominated by annual grasses, even though it looks really bright and garish, it can actually serve pretty well as camouflage sometimes. A lot of animals, obviously, in grasslands have adapted to eating grass, right? Grass leaves can be really tough. They can require a lot of digestion, both in terms of mechanical grinding and actual digestion to get nutrients from, right? The leaves themselves, at least, are very hard to digest. Seeds are often very, very nutritious. In fact, we as humans have really exploited grass seeds. They feed the world. Just about all of our cereal grains are grass seeds. Things like corn, wheat, oats, barley, millet. These are all seeds from, or not millet, but all those except millet are seeds from grasses, in family Poaceae, right? But different animals have evolved to eat their grasses and their grass seeds in different ways, right? So for example, something like an elk practices what we call ruminant digestion, just like a cow. They have this very complex, specialized stomach that's able to use bacteria that they are sort of have a mutual relationship with to digest grass and grass seeds, right? Black-tailed jackrabbits and a lot of our rabbits are what we call hindgut fermenters, and they do something slightly different and slightly gross. They eat their poop. Coprophagy means poop eating, right? And so they have sort of a different but similar strategy where they take their grass through their system twice. They have this specialized organ in the back of their digestive system that helps break down tough grass leaves. So what they do is they eat grass, they poop out what we call cecal pellets, then they eat those. The cecal pellets have been broken down enough that when they eat them a second time, they can actually digest them well and get the nutrients out of them. And then some animals just kind of have behavioral adaptations. Instead of having mechanisms to digest this tough grass, they're just very selective about what they eat. They only eat the newest shoots, the things that are most digestible, to avoid sort of the stress here. And some animals really focus on just getting the seeds, avoiding these tough to digest grasses and just going after those little packets of nice, easily digestible nutrients in grass seeds. So something like a mourning dove might forage right on the ground, take advantage of all the seed that falls off of the plant onto the surface of the earth. You might even get like giant kangaroo rats, one of our California natives, that go around and forage and gather seeds together, sort of gather them all up when times are abundant to be able to store them. One of the ways they're able to do that, you can see here, is through cheek pouches, right? Giant kangaroo rats and a lot of other rodents have these massive cheek pouches. Even though they can't hold seeds well, they can store a lot of them in their face, take them back to a storehouse and use for later. Okay, I think I might call it there. We'll finish off our grassland stuff after the midterm, but I will only put stuff on the study guide as far as we got through today. If anyone has any questions between now and the midterm, feel free to get in touch with us. And apart from that, thank you all. We'll see you on Tuesday.